Yeah, I really appreciate the privilege of being able to talk and have a little bit of involvement with this discussion. Dr. Michelson's whole thesis is a very intriguing one, and I just want to thank Dr. Michelson for his excellent treatment of the subject and just really making us more aware of some of the issues in global Christianity and what it might mean for us. So really appreciate Dr. Michelson's talk and also the book. It's wonderful. So what I would like to do is respond in a way that sort of has a little bit of an Eastern twist. I would like to comment basically on one key point of Dr. Michelson's lecture, and that is the tendency of post-Western Christianity to be more experiential in nature. More specifically, in light of the mass migration from non-Western countries to the West, what might be the impact of this shift in orientation on how we practice our theology and missions? Also, a question that deserves our attention is the potential effect such a change will have on theological training in particular. So first of all, I'd like to begin my comment with sort of an Eastern twist, like I said. It has been my observation in the former Soviet Union, for example, that within the collectivist cultures of that region, there is a growing tendency to reject, albeit quietly, common Western models of both cross-cultural ministry and traditional forms of theological training. In research, for example, that my staff and I conducted between 2001 and 2005, we interviewed approximately 120 church leaders about Western missionary efforts in the area. And what we found was that when Russian and Ukrainian church leaders truly open up and share their personal opinions about American missions efforts, over 70% of the participants had mostly negative impressions of the effectiveness of Western-trained missionaries. Now, the cause of this perceived ineffectiveness was what most cited what the cause to be what they call a lack of effective preparation and training, mostly in the form of the training for cross-cultural missions. So church leaders in the region often perceive the training Western evangelicals receive to be inadequate to the task of evangelism and discipleship in that context. So what they appear to favor is the kind of training that is more experiential, more practical, basically practical language learning, cross-cultural ministry experience. Those kinds of things are preferred over formal training. In fact, many evangelical leaders in that region see Western missionary efforts as largely unproductive and impotent to effect the kind of change that they really think that their people need. So one example I have is one Russian pastor. When we interviewed him, he said this. He said, the gospel Americans bring here is not the true gospel. He also said that Americans do not know how to disciple our people, end quote. Some mission agencies are in fact beginning to respond to such perceptions and are beginning to modify their approach so that the models of ministry that they use are actually born from within the cultural context rather than from our side of the pond. So there is some movement toward more natural and contextual models of ministry, and that movement definitely represents a positive trend. And so one thing that I would say is that as the center of gravity in Christianity shifts to outside the West, this could be good for how we practice missions in general. So it would seem that in collectivist context specifically, a more experiential, just like Dr. Michelson said, a more experiential, context-driven type of model of work really is required. And so those are the types of models of training that are preferred to more traditional Western models. And as influence on how we do ministry grows from outside the West, I would say that this could be a positive development. However, the other thing I would like to kind of comment on is that the impact of the more experiential nature of global Christianity may also cut in a different direction. In fact, recent dissertation research conducted by a fellow named Insur Shamgunov in Central Asia may even provide a clue as to what that impact might be. His study shows a growing dissatisfaction with specifically Western models of theological training, and in some cases with Western theology itself. He interviewed evangelical representatives from 10 different nationalities, including Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Russian, Tatar, Uzbek, Uyghur, and Kurdish Christian church leaders. And the consensus among these church leaders is that there is a disconnect between existing theological training and the actual skills that church leaders need to conduct ministry in Central Asia in particular. Since the training they receive tends to originate in Western institutional settings, this amounts to a rejection of Western theological training specifically. So the rejection of such training in their perspective is based largely on this observation that they make in Central Asia. Those who receive Western theological training, they say, are not nearly as effective in ministry as those who do not. So in that particular collectivist context, what I would say is that formal training in theology often appears useless to practicing the faith. In fact, in his interviews, one of the leaders that he interviewed observed this. He said that graduates of theological training begin talking a strange language about strange problems, become useless in the ministry, and often want to emigrate to the West. So what's interesting about this is that the attitude really has consequences for the church in Central Asia, because an emphasis on practical ministry rather than theological training may potentially mean really what I would say a dearth of believers trained in theology in that part of the world. And a rejection of theological training can easily result in divergent and often conflicting perspectives on Christian doctrine. And indeed, some extreme theological diversions away from orthodoxy have been observed among Eastern and Southern evangelicals. So what I think is that it would be therefore very important for more indigenous forms of theological and missiological training to be established in non-Western Christian contexts if we in the West are going to continue to have an effective role in missions in those areas. And we're going to need to remain, therefore, on the cutting edge of that kind of training. So it appears that while on the one hand there would likely be a positive impact on how we practice our faith and missions, with a more holistic, relationship-oriented approach being the result of the influence you see on the West from outside the West. On the other hand, more collectivist and experiential forms of Christianity also appear to reject the more formal and rigorous study and teaching of theology. So as the world's migration patterns result in far greater contact between Western and non-Western forms of Christianity, and in the context of the Western Church's tendency to follow the prevalent trends in most anything that we do, the influence of this rejection of Western model of theological training could represent a future fundamental shift in the quality of the theological preparation that we provide. So in way of conclusion, what I'd like to say is that with the current massive levels of migration from East and South into the West, here in Spokane, it's kind of amazing to me that you have so many Arabs moving in, Arab Christians, as well as people from other parts of the world. There are over 40,000 Russian speakers here, many of whom are believers. With this growing migration from East and South into the West, really the open question is, what will this mean for the Western Church? And in particular, how we practice and train for missions and theology. So in light of the inevitable changes in world Christianity that Dr. Michaelson has illuminated, this is one question that really should be thoroughly researched in the future. So I just want to thank you all for allowing me to participate in this great interaction on a fabulously interesting topic of discussion that Dr. Michaelson has raised. Thanks again for everything.